At any rate, so this is the debate session for the Inaccessibility and Bias session that took place this morning. And we have, do we have all, I think we've only got 4 of our 5 panelists. Yating Zhang may not be here yet. And I'm trying to get, and we also have, I have Columba Stewart, Maya Kominko, Miri Rubin, Cornelis van Lith or Eric van Lith?
Oh, that's Cornelis, thank you.
Cornelis van Lith, listed as discussants. What I'd like to do is start off briefly with, say, 3 to 5 minutes from each of the discussants, raising whatever issues came to your mind in seeing these presentations, and then quickly go through the presenters before opening up completely to the floor. I do have, at this point, half a dozen questions from the floor that were sent in beforehand, and anyone who wants to send in a question at this point, just put it in chat, and we'll see how many people that oh, we're missing Matthew and Stacy. Okay. Stacy, I saw earlier. She said, "Oh no, I saw an email from her." Of course, this is very early in the morning in California. So, which of course, some people who are already here, like Genevieve, know how early it is in California, but Stacy may be joining us, I'm hoping. So if I could, let me take them in the order in which the names came to me. Maya Kominko, were there any observations or questions that you wanted to come up with?
Just a very, I mean, it's a thought that might not directly might not be of direct relevance to all the papers, but it relates to Father Columba's excellent lecture, which is about looking at the materials through lenses of 19th century, 19th century collectors. I'm a Byzantinist by training, and it occurs to me that very much that's what happens now with digitization often is not quite the same, but rather akin to what happened in early archaeology, when archaeologists were digging through Byzantine and late antique layers to dig for classical archaeology. And I'm not saying that this is direct parallel to what happens with digitization projects that select the specific material that is of specific interest to modern scholars. But if that was a distraction of Byzantine history, what happens now is a bit of an erosion. So if the manuscripts, if we continue digitization, which sort of aims to cherry pick the best manuscripts, we're going to finally write out much of the history out of history writing. Which is one of the reasons why I'm so greatly appreciative of what Father Columba and Hemel are doing. But I think that this is something that we should perhaps discuss a little bit more, how much our efforts to give access and to develop scholarships are driven by very narrowly defined questions.
Good, thank you. What I'd like to do is, because I've got, actually, Father Columba, you're here as both a participant and a discussant. So what I'd like to do is go through the people who are just discussants and ask each of you for a question, and then go through all of the participants and start off with answers to those questions. Miri Rubin, was there something that you'd particularly like to bring up? You're going to have to unmute yourself.
Good. Yes, well, very many, and you indeed gave me 5 minutes, so I've tried to pack them neatly, so I shall start. I always do what I'm told to do. So the organizers of this impressive event, or indeed a set of events, have chosen for one of their strands this session's topic: inaccessibility and bias in a world that has never been so preoccupied with both.
Mm-hmm.
The last few months have been learning times for many of us and have produced a deepening understanding and awareness of the ingrained systemic as well as deeply personal bias that evoked by skin color and by gender. These times have also shown how uneven and hence unjust is accessibility to healthcare, education, to informative and comforting communication in hard times. Much of this inaccessibility and bias is the result of long historical processes associated often with conquest and colonization, which saw the movement of people and goods in unprecedented directions and at extraordinary rates in the period that starts just after what we normally call the medieval. These phenomena were and are global in reach. So historians have been seeking ways to explore what does this mean for them? This awareness of the global reach, what does it mean for historians in terms of their practice? And here medievalists have been tested. How might we make our materials, our beloved manuscripts, inscriptions, devotional objects, part of conversations about inclusion and post-colonial justice? How to bring these sensibilities home, as it were, to the continent that was the habitat for medieval cultures. So I attended in dark archives 12 lectures and 2 splendid plenary addresses, and I've learned a great deal. I noted that language could create exclusion and be a sign of bias. Scott Bruce, of course, showed how central were Greek texts to the making of some of the most important religious practices of the Middle Ages. Quite apart from the formative monastic and patristic Greek texts, there was the influence less often noted on homiletics, as he showed in Anglo-Saxon England. It is really impossible to imagine the cult of the Virgin Mary without the influence of Greek practices, particularly true in the early centuries, but recurrent in later ones, and even before the so-called Renaissance. And language could exclude in other ways. I was really impressed when I heard Anna Dorofeeva, and she's right here, tell us rendering a cryptic, sort of rendering language cryptic and challenging is a way of creating inner groups of readers, select identities of those alone who might share in them. The fortunes of manuscripts and objects were dependent indeed on the disposition of political power. Anastasia Ropa and Edgar Ropp showed how marginalized and dispersed became Livonian documents within the kingdoms that later defined the region's destiny: Russia, Poland, Sweden. Less dramatically, perhaps, but no less disruptive, were the attacks on Catholic liturgical practices and the books that supported them, as the Tudor dynasty under Edward VI embraced with great commitment the new religion of Protestantism. And so the polyphony developed at Worcester Cathedral based on the model of Notre Dame in Paris, and contained in the liturgical books assembled for us in her talk so expertly by Karen Desmond, was dispersed as books were violently destroyed. Fragments and lesser parts, spurned by biased scholars and often inaccessible because of their hidden reuse in myriad ways, have appeared in many of the papers. Lisa Fagan Davis has, of course, been the advocate of work with fragments for many years now, but today I thought she movingly spoke about the solace, the peace, the consolation which making fragments into large wholes offered her in these troubled times. Sarah Ellis Nilsson spoke of her project, making discarded fragments into liturgical books, especially calendars, that reveal Swedish language practices of what she called lived religion. Not an obvious, not a term not without problems. And we may well think of the graffiti presented by Matthew Champion as fragments of lived religion too. And I don't know about you, but I found most affecting his example from an English village church in 1348, an English description that goes, "God help me, God help me, God help me." So the digital tools displayed by almost all of our speakers are connecting, retrieving, and piecing together texts and fragments who were never previously studied because of bias and inaccessibility. And most inaccessible of all, surely, is that which has not survived for us to study. But Mike Castemont of Antwerp with Volkert Karstorp of the Royal Netherlandish Academy have set out to put that right too. Using a formula developed by biodiversity statistician Chow, they try to calculate how many more literary manuscripts in Middle Netherlandish had existed and no longer do. Intriguing. So digital humanities tools are central to all these pursuits of discarded, broken, lost, and disparaged materials. But so are the very humane traditions of the humanities tout court, like Genevieve McNutt and Carrie Thomas's reflections on what it means to meet a manuscript and how medieval makers sought to arrange such encounters. And we can also always draw from the empathy of those with creative imaginations who may not be historians, just as Stacey Voss showed us in her communication looking at Virginia Woolf. So we can only hope that our scholarly lives contribute to making our world less biased and its treasures more accessible, combining digital technologies with a progressive remaking of the humanities. And I consider very much Father Columba and his colleagues' project to be that sort of progressive remaking of the humanities. We may do so, and our archives has already shed a great deal of light. Thank you.
Thank you. Cornelis van Lith, did you want to add a piece there?
Thank you. I'm going to argue the exact opposite of that, actually. So we'll see where we end up in the conversation. I was thinking of two different points that correlate with each other, speaking about bias and inaccessibility that is inherent in the digital world. Looking at Anna Dorofeeva's presentation on the abbreviations, it made me think, okay, how are we going to encode this in the digital world? How are we going to digitally represent this? And this goes all the more, of course, for non-Latin scripts. And thinking here of the Himmel Authority file that Dom Columba is proposing, and it will be very interesting to see if there's multilingual support there. And this is a great necessity when the vast majority of manuscripts contain texts that are in non-Latin script. And yet we are trying to communicate through a medium, the digital world, which is solidly and firmly based in the Latin script, and in fact a sort of a reduced form of it. In its most reduced form, we know it as ASCII, the American standard for encoding in the computer world. If we don't address these issues now, we will be left with the consequences for the rest of our lives. And so it is up to us to speak up about this. And this relates to another point, which is the sort of the ethical question of who gets to digitize things anyway, and who owns things once they become digital. I was sort of thinking thinking very much of this in Genevieve's presentation, who, to me, the point that I got out of it was like, well, look at that. You know, they want to edit as much as they can. They want to make available things for a large audience that they consider to be generally useful. That's the term that she mentioned, generally useful. But what is generally useful? And then you see people struggle with this very vague concept, and it's very much up to the to the editor to decide what is. look at Matthew Champion's presentation on the graffiti, what others might see as defacement or broken, once you actually look at that, as he said, like, well, all of a sudden it's everywhere. All of a sudden you see it everywhere, and once you start to document it, you actually see how much you can gain from it, how much information you can gain from it. And these are sort of these blind spots that we can easily create. Digitization is an editorial practice, and we make decisions, we make editorial decisions in digitizing one object over the other, prioritizing it. Leaving with one final comment, who owns these things? And in this aspect, we ought to be very careful how we proceed. I'm thinking of a comparison here with digital warfare, which sounds maybe like an odd comparison, but countries are now engaging in digital warfare. But countries find it very hard, governments find it very hard to actually acknowledge it as acts of war, and they find it very hard indeed to retaliate in terms of waging actual war. So they kind of feel that digital things that happen in the digital world shouldn't be considered the same as in the real world. And I think there's a danger in our world of digitization for this as well. We're all very much aware of the problems pertaining to taking artifacts, cultural artifacts, from their actual place of residence, from their actual local communities, and shipping them off to God knows where. And I think we should be asking the same questions when it comes to digitization. When does digitization become digital looting? And when will we actually have a conversation about, well, should we actually let this decision be up to the people who own the actual artifacts themselves?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Dom Columba, I'd like to move to you next. You're sort of the hinge figure here because you are both a discussant and a participant. Do you want to, your reactions to what the other discussants have mentioned, and as a participant, as a discussant yourself, are there other questions you think you'd like to pose or observations you'd like to make?
I think the first thing I'd like to say is that I approach this both as director of Himmel, and today is the 17th anniversary of my directorship at Himmel, so it's been quite a while. And also as a scholar of essentially late antique Christian texts. And my work tends to be non-Latin, although obviously as a Benedictine monk, Latin is special and close to my heart. And certainly the monastic tradition and monastic literature in the West is very important to me. But my research has tended to focus more on Eastern Christian literature, working in Latin, Greek, and then in Syriac particularly. And I'm very aware, as we look at bias and inaccessibility, of the way that our perception of the Eastern traditions especially has been shaped by the accident of what was taken to Western libraries. And this is obviously one of the acute problems in Syriac studies, where the essential reference works were all published in the 18th to early 19th centuries. And they were not based on manuscripts that remained in their original locations, but they were based on manuscripts that were taken to the West because of accidents of location, such as all of the Syriac manuscripts that happened to be in Egypt from the 9th century, including some very early ones, taken to the Vatican, taken to London, and so on. And also this problem of cherry picking that we've talked about, of people who pick up a manuscript they think is valuable, they think it's interesting, something there they would like to follow up on or publish because it relates to their interest or their particular doctrinal or ecclesiastical orientation. And so this has all skewed our perception. So I think the importance of trying to work with communities that still have their manuscripts in these regions, so that we recover not only a fuller picture of the older manuscript tradition, but we also see how these traditions have in many cases continued as living manuscript traditions, as living literary traditions, because there's a bias toward the past in Syriac studies, just as there often is in Greek and Latin. This sort of assumption that earlier is more interesting, earlier is more important, this kind of genetic family tree approach to things and trying to get back to the roots. And what we're finding with manuscripts in places like Iraq and Southeast Turkey is flourishing Neo-Aramaic traditions of original composition, which are using these earlier patterns, just as happened in the Neo-Aramaic tradition of Northern Iraqi Judaism, for example, that these were very much thriving communities until very recently. And the Jewish communities were forced out. The Christians are sort of teetering on the edge of that. The other area is Christian Arabic, which came up a little bit in the Q&A after my keynote this morning, that there's this whole tradition of Arabic as a truly Christian language, originally a language of translation, then later a language of original composition, which has been relatively little studied, but is the actual lived Christianity of these communities in the Middle East. And a large part of the material that we've been digitizing is precisely Christian Arabic. And I like translations. I'm really interested in translations, so I find that piece of it interesting. The original compositions are interesting. And then also the number of European Christian writings translated into Arabic in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which are really fascinating ways into what was the intellectual and devotional culture of a region which found itself caught between its ancient Eastern Christian roots and then the Western Christian missionary thing. There's a lot of interesting work being done on this. So that's one thing I want to say. Second thing is, I'm very aware in my own work of how much we have made as scholars of texts that survive in a single manuscript. And the mistake of thinking the single manuscript represents either a widespread tradition or thinking that the single manuscript represents what there is, right? That this is truly indeed representative of what may have been there at one time, and forgetting the enormous eclipse of the things that are lost. And the more I go into this work with a combination of Hemmel and my own research, the more aware I am of fundamental texts which have shaped entire perceptions, Syriac asceticism, early Alexandrian Christianity, which survive only in a sole manuscript. And this is extraordinary when you realize, as I've described it, the scholarly skyscrapers we built on foundations that are about the size of a small coin. And the sort of sensitivity to that reality, I think, is important for us. And then lastly, to Cornelis's question about getting beyond the Western bias using ASCII and computer projects and so on, we're committed in the Hemmel Authority File project, the HAF project, to having full native script names, titles, etc., in addition to Western forms where they exist and transliteration. So we really are trying to make this something that can be useful to people working in a variety of linguistic and cultural frameworks. So that is something that's important to us. As to this question of when does digitization become digital looting and who makes the best decision, I'd be happy to hear what other people think about that. I think the best situation we're in right now is that the people who have the manuscripts are the ones who provide access. Now, if they don't provide access, there is no digitization. And if they can do it themselves, that's great. In some cases, they can't do it themselves, and that's why they seek partnerships. So where we go with that and what the broader theoretical implications of that are, I'd be happy to hear thoughts of others. I think that's enough.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And moving on to the people who are presenters simply, Stacy Voss, you're here. Hello?
Hi there. Yes,
Hi
hello.
there. Yes, I'm just at this point looking for reactions, questions, observations, you know, to the group as a whole, or to particular questions you want to raise about other presentations in the group. So you're on.
Is this for all panelists, or?
Yeah, I will one by one. I will go through each of the panelists, and then I will go through. I've received about half a dozen questions already that were posed by email or in the Q&A before we started up here, and I'll go through those. But also, if you want to throw questions out to other members of the panel, go right ahead. So, whatever you'd like to do.
Well, I just really appreciated these comments from Dr. Stewart about the accidents of location. I think that that's really important for us to keep thinking about. And Cornelis's comments about digitization as an editorial process. One thing that I have come across in the last few weeks is actually at the Huntington, there was a presentation done by conservationists. And I realized how little I know about the conservation of manuscripts and that whole process, and whether or not it's documented. So just the idea that we're still engaging in material processes, changing manuscripts, even when we're experiencing them as digital objects, there's another process that's going on that we might not be aware of, that I'm very interested in that.
Genevieve McNutt, was there something you'd like to put in at this point?
Oh, thank you. And I've very much enjoyed the conference, and it's introduced me to all kinds of things that I now know that I don't know. Particularly around digitization, and coming at this from looking at the 18th and 19th century and how different and sometimes similar they are to what we're struggling with now. I suppose my question for the other panelists is mostly about how they locate the things that they study and the challenges of accessibility in that. I mean, looking at a story by Woolf that I think is not often read or studied, or how does one find ciphers that catalogers might not themselves recognize, I suppose. Yes, and all kinds of interesting things that I look forward to hearing about.
Okay, good. Matthew Champion, are you here?
No, he's yet to join us, Michael.
All right, I didn't think I saw him. So Anna Dorofeeva.
Yes.
Were there questions or observations you'd like to start off with?
Yes, I think there's been quite a lot of really interesting points raised so far, and I guess I just want to comment on a few of them from the point of view of my own work. Mm-hmm. And particularly I want to highlight that I'm not a specialist in digitization. I haven't worked with digitizations of manuscripts in digitization teams. So there are people out there far better able to comment on that aspect of things than I am. But I was struck when listening to the comments of Miri and Cornelis and Columba that this idea of inaccessibility and bias is actually still one that, you know, is current today and has lasted from at least the period that I study, from early medieval ciphers, where who reads what and how it is read and how it is understood is entirely dependent on what you know and where you come from. So context, in a way, is everything in that sort of approach. And I was thinking when you were speaking about the difficulties and challenges of putting things online that can be made accessible to people with all sorts of access requirements, ranging from physical disability to a whole host of other things that I am not qualified to speak about. And for me, that sort of thing is very interesting as a conceptual idea, and how do we as historians and scholars approach that sort of problem. And I was reminded of something that Helmut Reimitz wrote about in an article of his from a few years ago, where he spoke about social logic, the social logic of texts. And this is an idea that I've come to subscribe to quite heavily in my own work, where the idea of social logic is that the context of a manuscript and the layers of its context matter, are the entire context for that manuscript. They determine what that manuscript is. And I would be tending to view modern digitizations as multi-layered objects, because they represent historical objects, and there's not just that digitization layer between the physical manuscript object and the digitized version, but there's also the multiplicity of layers before that, the additions over hundreds of years, the multiple rebindings and rearrangements of quires, the occasional heavy reworking of the manuscript structure while it was being made as well. So I think this idea of kind of almost the death of the author for manuscripts is a very interesting one, and I think the one that I see the most promise for in terms of going forward in making things accessible today.
Thank you. Thank you. Were there any specific questions any of you would like to pose to each other here? Anyone?
I do.
Yes.
If I may. So no, Anna prompted me to sort of emboldened me to put a question that is not unrelated to some of Cornelis's context, which is comments, which is the issue that most digitization projects are collaborative. Indeed, Anna herself said, "Oh, I'm not really a digital person like some others here. I do my thing with my manuscript and so on." So what does that mean about the formation, about voice, about a whole lot of practices that traditionally I'm not saying is how it ought to be, but traditionally have been about the scholar going about their scholarship and saying thank you in the footnotes and asking advice, but on the whole, usually sitting at a desk on their own. And now the very notion of a desk on one's own is also sort of, you can be working together, even if you're not proximate, that's sort of obvious. But I'm just wondering about the issue of exactly the social context of the production of these great projects of digitization, what it means in terms of responsibility, and in a way, the way you learn together and you create together. It brings to mind actually a lovely volume from 2013 that Jonathan Wilcox edited. It has a wonderful title, something like Scraped and Bound and some other third verb. And it's all about the practices of producing manuscripts in medieval, particularly early medieval, a monastic environment mostly. It talks there about communities of practice, about how in a scriptorium, it's no one particular person who's in charge. It's a whole lot of people that work together to produce, and they start writing in the same fashion, and they have the same style of expression and so on. So what I'm asking is, I would really like to hear, if we're talking about the ethics as Cornelis has encouraged us to, and as I was hoping we might, then what is emerging in terms of the intellectual style of group digitization projects, and what that means about the way people develop their own intellectual voice within them.
Anyone want to take that up?
Well, if maybe I can say just a few words. I think that this is, you know, it might just be the very first time this question is asked out loud, right? And that's where we are as sort of humanities scholars at large. We're in this very early stage of these kinds of discussions. And then we have to look at the sort of the practices that we see right now. And then we might ask Mr. Stewart how he has been collaborating with his project. I, for my part, find it a little disheartening to see that Himmel is taking a rather large stake in these digital photos, that they only put their logo together with the photos and not the logo or the name of the organizations which actually digitize these manuscripts. I'm thinking of the Dream Sea project in the Far East, Savama DCI from Timbuktu, the Iraq project led by Father Najib. There might be good explanations to this, but I think people have just been sort of start to do it, and now we need to have this conversation, okay, like how should we do it best? But I'm sure that Mr. Stewart has something to say about how he has been doing this for the last 15, 17 years.
Can I respond, please? So first of all, we've been doing this since 1965. So this isn't a recent invention. We started microfilming in Europe at that point and then continued. Every photograph of every manuscript has the unique identifying project code of that particular library on it. And if you look right next to the image in V. Himmel Reading Room, you'll see prominently exact identification of the repository, its location, etc. So I don't think we're suppressing the identity of the owning library. In fact, our new website, which is coming out early next month, has an exhaustive list of all the repositories so that people can have a kind of different way into the material, so that we can emphasize the fact that these belong to discrete collections, each one of which has its own history, and we've been able to amplify some of that information on the website. So in terms of the larger question of the emerging, the kind of sociology of scholarship or the intellectual sociology of these projects, that's a really interesting question. And sometimes it depends on the nature of the partner. In some cases, they may not have anybody in the owning institution that really can read the texts because they're written in earlier languages. They have scholars in their tradition. They don't happen to be on the staff of that library. And so it's a case then of looping in people who do have the expertise. In other cases, Savama is a great example in Bamako with the West African material. They have people who are actually describing the manuscripts, doing metadata creation, and working with them with that metadata, their approach to description, and then trying to mediate between that and then the requirements of online access is a really interesting and creative process. Lastly, the Dream Sea project, I don't really understand your point, Cornelis. It's not a Himmel project. It's a completely separate project. We were asked if we could provide online access. We created the separate Dream Sea site for it, which I think gives the project its own identity. But Maya, as the funder, may have more to say about that.
Okay. Could I perhaps respond to that?
Mm.
I wanted to point out that, yes, for this Dream Sea project, when you actually look at the photos, then on the right, it has a little rights section. It says rights, and then it says attribution provided by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and then the logo of the Himmel. And it doesn't say anything about Dream Sea. So this is kind of the thing I was thinking of.
I just, I mean, I think that this is sort of a very small thing. It seems to be spiraling out of control, and perhaps it would be. May I suggest, Cornelis, that you speak to the Dream Sea project, because everything that is, I know them quite well. I helped to establish this. Well, I reached out to Jan van der Putten and Oman Fatur Rahman, who are running this, to help them establish the project. And let me assure you that they were the ones who wanted to work with Hamel. And they are very happy about the cooperation. And Hamel has provided help and support above and beyond anything that the project expected. And these are not my words, these are their words. And I think that we can't push it too far, because if you seem to be more uncomfortable with this arrangement than they are. This is the arrangement. They are not deprived of voice. They are not deprived of free will. This is the arrangement that they help to forge in partnership with Hamel. It's not something that Hamel has inflicted on them. So maybe, should I put you in touch with Jan van der Putten and Oman Faturrahman? Would that be helpful?
Oh, that would be great, of course. That would be great. And I mean, I'm only bringing this up because Himmel is such a huge party in the digitization world. And because with that, Himmel carries a lot of responsibility. So that's why I only sort of made it a very specific example here. But as I said, I think this is a conversation that, well, in my view, we ought to have a conversation about, like, what is the status of a digital object?
I agree, but sorry.
And I think, well, actually, this is posted as a debate session, so we could continue the debate if we want to. And certainly, the issue of whether we are replicating in digital media the kind of control structures and so on that have existed for paper and parchment media is a question that we need to keep in mind as we go about our work. But I'd also like to go on a little bit. There are half a dozen questions that I've gotten from the floor that I would like to pose. We also have one more speaker who Yating Zhang, was she able ever to contact us? She was having trouble.
No, Yating is yet to join us as well, I'm afraid.
All right, right. So
yeah, I was just going to say Yating has she's been having internet problems today. She warned me a little earlier that she was worried about getting online. Matthew Champion has just emailed me and he's trying to get online right now, so hopefully I can help him to arrive in this Zoom room shortly.
Okay, yeah, when he does arrive, I do have a couple of questions for him that people have posed.
Okay, great.
So, but actually, it's interesting as we're talking about the social issues that are involved in our work. One of the questions from the floor is from Michelle Warren, specifically to Genevieve McNutt, but it has applications and implications for all of us. Michelle Warren comments that the distinction between accessible and convenient archives is really important. How much the editorial corpus has been produced merely because of proximity or early adaptation of electric lighting? I'm thinking of some specific 19th century editions that went on to have enormous influence on what are still considered to be the important texts or manuscripts. In her talk, she refers to some similar issues with the distinction known and unavailable. With McNutt's emphasis on convenience, we see another angle on how unstable availability can be. I also want to know more about George Ellis as a defender of the interests of British enslavers. His specimens of metrical romances remained very influential all through the 19th century. Genevieve, did you want to take that up?
Sure. So the two people mostly producing work on medieval romance right at that period were Joseph Ritson, who's been the subject of my dissertation, and George Ellis. And Ritson is an atheist, he's a vegetarian, he's a political radical, and he's well known as all of those things at the time. Whereas George Ellis comes from Jamaica, from a long line of wealthy planters on sort of both sides of his family. He's briefly a member of Parliament. He's a member of Canning Circle. He supports his cousin, Charles Rose Ellis, in that. And just the contrast between them and the way that they can both participate in this network of people working on this material has always been very striking to me. I don't see too much, at least I don't, direct influence of his politics on his selections, although partially not talking about politics is part of how that's expressed, that he has this wealth that allows him to travel and gives him leisure and gives him the ability to assist others, but he's not going to talk about where it comes from at all. And I'm very interested in how they select texts. If they're only focused on a fairly narrow range of the material that's accessible to them, particularly romances and songs, and then making further selections of what they consider best or representative. And then that's what ends up being published and accessible for some time. How much of that is reflecting sort of the general concerns at the time? How much is their own sort of idiosyncratic interests? Like Rinson, for example, is one of his sort of hobby horses is fairies, and that's why we have Sir Orfeo and Launfal in his collection of romances. Ellis is interested in a sort of particular kind of descriptive, picturesque poetry, so he'll include anything that's got that in it. But then how much is just what's accessible to them, what's not accessible, what's convenient, and just accidents of bad timing. Looking at Ellis's letters to Scott when he's describing the process of putting his specimens together, it's amazing to me how much it changes as Scott sends him material about the Auchinleck manuscript. So between when he first has the project and when it actually ends up published over a course of a few years, his understanding of the particularly Arthurian and Carolingian, or texts relating to Charlemagne, which form a key part of his collection, and his ideas of what the manuscripts are and how they're related to each other and what he needs to include changes quite a bit. Which got me a bit off topic, but yes, so
well,
they're just unwillingness to travel.
So there's both a personal component and a sort of cultural historical component to how these things develop. Actually, it reminds me in an odd way of my own field. I've done editions of primarily late Middle English devotional and contemplative texts, some of which survive in relatively large numbers of manuscripts. Not as many as the Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is 80 plus manuscripts, but I've been working on two texts, both of which have survived in 60 plus manuscripts, for neither of which has there ever been a critical edition. One of them, there is the semi-popular Teams series, the sort of undergraduate texts in the US. There is an edition of Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection there. But there is definitely an emphasis on what you can effectively teach to undergraduates. It's definitely give them more romances, give them stories, but other genre of literature have been passed over. And it's interesting, it also raises the issue, how did I find the manuscripts of these texts? Well, Ian Doyle at Durham traveled all around Europe looking at everything with Middle English in it that he could find, and he kept lists. And when I started working on one of the texts, he provided me with a manuscript list. And every once in a while, someone knowing I was working on the project would say, oh, by the way, I ran across a copy of this in such and such place, or it came up for sale in such and such place. And some of them, I mean, there was one copy that belonged to Barking Abbey, which was one of the major convents of late medieval England. A royal foundation, you know, I mean, dating back to Anglo-Saxon times and so on like that. And the manuscript turned up in the early 20th century. It was bought by Foyle at auction. Foyle was a book dealer. He liked it and kept it in his own private library. Foyle died. His daughter Christina Foyle inherited the collection. When she had it, I got a microfilm that was made by somebody who actually took a hand camera and took pictures of all of the pages. When she died, it went up for auction again. It was bought into private hands and no one knows where it is. Except that I happen to have a microfilm of it. So that those kind of issues are still constantly around. And it really is. I'm reminded of Michael Ende's children's novel, the Unendliche Geschichte, where in the land of fantasy, they're all worried by these outbreaks of the neats. That suddenly in the middle of a fairy tale that everybody has always known, there's a nothing. There's a gap. People have forgotten that piece of the tale. And it seems constantly there's this battle against the neats, against the lacunae in, you know, things that, well, yeah, actually it goes interesting. There was an interesting question. Where is it? Oh, actually, it was the question that was directed to you. The idea of accessible and convenient, or as Michelle Warren does it, the known and the unknown, and the known but not available, and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting set of distinctions. Somebody else want to jump in on that particular topic? Or shall we let that one go? And
I guess I could jump in with a kind of a small point, Dr. Sargent, and your work has been so helpful. I work on devotional texts myself, so I appreciate everything that you've done. I was just wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about standards for scholarship and how, I mean, for instance, my paper was on a modern text, and I think that in medieval we do tend to expect much more, that people will have looked at manuscripts for the texts that they're researching, but not necessarily if we trust the edition. So my question is, when do we need to see the manuscript if we're writing on something? I came across something, a detail in the wolf story that I didn't know about. I heard from Anna Nadine Pike, who has just started working at the Bodleian this week. She had a different edition of the wolf story that said flesh and fens have divided us, instead of flesh and pens have divided us. And that was the main line I used in my paper. So it made me realize that it was, you know, once again, I haven't seen the manuscript. It's not digitized. I can't go to New York right now. And so I'm just curious about if digitization is, if you all see it sort of changing our perception about how important it is to see the original manuscript for the text that we're working on.
Somebody want to pick that up?
Well, I think it's horses for courses. It really depends what sort of questions you ask. No, it's I mean, it's on basic level. It's better to have access to the digital than not to have access at all. But there is also something else, as you were speaking about. When do we need to see a manuscript? I work on late antique geography, and there is a source called Expositio Totus Mundi, which everyone quotes, and much of the late antique geography has been built on this. But the problem is there is no manuscript. There is an 18th century edition, and we don't really know if this work, this work has probably existed, but it's so unreliable. And I think that what worries me very often is that we work on history as if these were disembodied texts. And this is coming back to what Father Columba said, that it is important what manuscripts are there, and it should be part of the discussion. How many manuscripts? Are they similar? And it's not necessarily trying to build a stemma and go back to the original, but also to understand why they differ and how they differ. But not really sure whether this is still on the topic.
Yes. Mary?
So Carrie Thomas really addresses the whole issue of the presence of the manuscript. So I recommend that you listen to that. I just was wondering also whether we might bring in something else which is not unrelated to the question of what Father Columba called very nicely the sociology of this type of intellectual enterprise. And I'm reminded of the presidential address given by David Wallace at Medieval Academy. It must have been the last one we had face-to-face. It was Philadelphia. Was that 2019? Yeah. So that was a great one, not least because of the all the wonderful manuscripts we saw. But so David Wallace's presidential address talked about the gendered nature of procedures of editing in the early 20th century. He traced the famous history of who really edited and who really found the Marjorie Kemp manuscript, how often, daughters and wives and sisters and ex-wives and mothers and whatnot participated in projects and their labor was not acknowledged. Of course, I don't expect that to be happening anymore. But nonetheless, if we are trying to examine the ethics of our enterprises, as a number of people on this panel are interested in doing, and going back to this issue of groups and who manages them and how they're managed and what's expected in terms of distribution of labor and recognition, I was just wondering, you who have experienced projects such as these, and really I'd be very happy to hear that all is well, but I'm just wondering whether there is a sort of reinscription of some of the other types. It doesn't have to be a necessarily gendered one, but how our social practices creep into the practices of the digitizing research group, how people who are in precarious research assistant contracts fit in or can indeed develop voice and intellectual independence given their precarious and long and short-term situation, etc. Whether people have as yet observations that can guide us perhaps to better practices in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's Matthew Champion. You've joined us after all.
Hello, Matthew. Good.
It's quite close to, Michael, to some of your work. I mean, it's even the question of if a manuscript was written by a man or a woman. I mean, after all, you wrote about Marguerite Porete.
Yeah, Marguerite Porete is an example. Also, what I was thinking of immediately was Marjorie Kemp and Julian of Norwich. That Julian was known of from the beginning of the 20th century. Hope Emily Allen actually discovered Marjorie Kemp. I mean, she was working in the British Museum, and one of the conservators came over to her and said, Colonel Butler Bowden has brought in this manuscript that's been in the family, and he has no idea, except it seems to be mystical stuff. And she started thumbing through it and recognized passages and said, this is the complete copy of the book of Marjorie Kemp. And she proposed an edition, and it was proposed to her that she needed a male philologist as her co-editor. So it became Meach and Allen, and Meach, of course, at Sanford Brown Meach at the Dictionary of Middle English Project in Michigan. They fell out, and it became Meach's edition. And of course, Julian of Norwich was finally edited by College and Walsh, who shoved two women scholars who had been working on the text aside in order to take it over and put it out. They've gone from, Marjorie and Julian have gone from unknown at the beginning of the 20th century to being in the standard teaching anthology for undergraduate English majors in the US. So things do change socially in interesting ways. Actually, Matthew, I've got a couple of questions for you.
I'm here.
All right. They both came in on the Q&A line. Yeah, one of them comments, a sea of lost words, the medieval graffiti inscriptions of English parishes churches. Thanks for the engaging presentation that brings back the attention to one of the core issues of our field of study, graffiti as an archival, in an archival perspective. I have a few questions. Graffiti, as you rightly said, stand between tangible and intangible. This is the main reason why their preservation and recognition are still debated. The concept of graffiti archive as a way to preserve this heritage, consequently, is not clear. Moreover, the accessibility as well, both on-site and virtually, is at a very initial stage, with the NHGS being the main reference point. In this sense, the concept of archive perfectly fits intending to preserve and disseminate graffiti heritage. However, what kind of archive can we figure out?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions in one.
A lot of questions, right? Well, we figured we may as well just shove you off the end of the duck and see if you can learn to swim.
Yeah, quite. What you have to also, well, first of all, understand is that graffiti studies in its modern sense is very, very new. So these sort of citizen science projects have really only been going now for, well, less than a decade, I suppose, in their real sense. There were no guidelines when we started this. So it essentially started with me in Norfolk, and it spread from there. So we've been really sort of feeling our way along. So our initial reaction was, oh, let's bung it all on, a database. That was, what we were doing elsewhere in archaeology. So it seemed like a sensible approach. The initial databases we came up with, frankly, it wasn't up to scratch. As we've learned more about the subject matter, we've changed our ideas about methods needed to archive it and subsequently access that data. So it really is a kind of evolutionary process. And really, being kind of pretty old school myself, when it comes to things like digital archiving, I had some fairly major questions about redundancy, about longevity. Was this a good way forward? Previous people who'd been studying graffiti literally were going out and making rubbings on the walls, and it was those rubbings which were being archived in a traditional sense and a traditional paper format. And to a certain extent, we're still using a paper format, simply because we back everything up. We have triple redundancy on everything, but we'll still print out original images as well. So this is an evolving archive, and in some respects, it's given us a chance to work right from the beginning again, and actually go back to basics and say what's going to work for this.
Good. Further comments along that strand? I have other questions. One for Stacey Voss. Why did Woolf choose Lydgate as the book Joan's mother urges her to read?
Oh, yeah, I saw that question, and thank you, Genevieve, for asking it. I believe that was your question. I really don't know. I just know that she seems to have combined a few of Lydgate's texts, and she refers to the Palace of Glass, but then she also talks about how Joan, the second protagonist of the second narrator of the story, is telling the story of Helen. And then she likens Joan's mother to Helen in the story. So it seems to be significant. I haven't thought about it too much. I haven't, the story is really a new discovery for me, actually. It's really interesting to be discovering new Virginia Woolf texts, but I hadn't come across it before, and this is why I'm glad I have colleagues and mentors in the 18th century and beyond. So, yeah, I think it's a great question. I just think that it's I guess Lydgate's one of the only canonical figures mentioned in the story, so he is important in that sense. Otherwise, the story is about these family papers that would have been dismissed. I think there's a fascinating scene that I talked about briefly in my paper, where the historian with whom the story begins is talking to a farmer, and he recommends the account books of the family over the diary of his grandmother, and clearly hasn't taken much of an interest in the diary. So in the narrative, Woolf is actually commenting on our selection process. You know, how do we choose manuscripts? And it seems that Joan's reading of Lydgate is something that is thrust upon her, that her family wants her to do, whereas this unknown manuscript that is carried by this other character named Richard, who sings the text that he has in his manuscript, those are the ones that interest her, the texts with no author. So I really want to keep thinking about it, though, so thank you.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Anastasia Ropa asked Genevieve, do you have any idea why the Romance of Percival was assessed as very modern? Was it by comparison to the Arthurian romances, which were published earlier, or did he compare it to other Percival romances, e.g. the French ones?
Oh, yes. In that quotation, Ellis is being somewhat glib and making a joke, in that he's decided he's not going to look at the manuscript, and therefore, of course, it's not worth looking at. So he has no basis whatsoever for that judgment. Though elsewhere and in other things, all of the people at that period are making quite a lot of effort to look at analogs across different languages to the extent that those are available to them. But of course, accessibility is very difficult there as well.
Another one, by the way, to Matthew. Should we consider graffiti in their physical aspect, scratched or traced on the walls, as an archival material, quote unquote, or is it just their documentation / reproduction that can be considered as such? Should we accept that the only possible graffiti archive is a physical / digital one made up from copies and reproductions, or are there other possibilities for an ad hoc solution, maybe on site? So do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I do at the moment. You know, there are, as I say, very early days for a lot of this. Should we consider it to be an archive? Well, we've been taking a slightly different approach, I think, to some previous graffiti researchers, in the fact that we've been taking a kind of a more archaeological approach. So in the past, a lot of people were looking at graffiti back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and a lot of those were coming at it very, very much from different fields. So it was seen and viewed really in terms of either from a text point of view. So it was seen literally as the record on the wall. But of course, that meant ignoring 90 or 95% of what was on the wall. The other approach, which is still really prevalent until very, very recently, was taking an art history approach, which means that the whole archive, as it were, was being examined, but it was being seen purely from an art history perspective. Can we treat it as an archive? I think we can treat it as an archive, certainly in archaeological terms, in the same way we would treat recent projects such as the one I've been doing recently at Oxford Hall, where we're actually recovering artifacts from beneath the floor, including books, manuscripts, everything else. We treat that as an archaeological archive. Is it an archive in our traditional, sort of library style sense? I think so. But I think in some respects we've lost the ability to read some of that archive. And it is about really what the approach we're trying to take these days is a really cross-disciplinary one. So, I would argue strongly that it's an archive. It's just an archive we're not sure what to do with, we're not sure how to protect, and we're certainly not sure how to read lots of it at the moment.
At this point, I don't seem to have any further questions from the floor. What would you guys like to talk about? What has been raised that you'd like to push a little further in our discussion here?
If I may, Michael, a few questions have been asked on the chat.
Yes, please.
Stephen Pink asks for Matthew, does this mean that our conception of writing is too narrow, that our archive should consist of many more kinds of artifacts with a semantic freight? No, that has been overlooked. He's just finished the question.
Yeah, just rereading that one again. Yeah, I think so. I think there was generally, when people started looking at graffiti, there was a concentration on text, and that was where the information was going to lie. That was where the meaning and the understanding were going to come from. They were going to come from text. What I've come to believe over the last 10 years is we can learn just as much from a lot of the imagery, and it's the text that's bound up with that imagery. It may not be written there, but certainly the use of the same markings, the same motifs, the same collections of motifs. Sometimes the graffiti reminds me much more of hieroglyphs than the traditional kind of artistic approach. So yeah, I think I see all graffiti as people essentially trying to communicate. So whether it's communicating love, hate, loss, fear, or just kind of I was here, but it is all graffiti is people trying to communicate, and therefore it has the same weight really, at least in my mind, as writing. So yeah, I would argue that perhaps we need to see it as in a slightly wider form.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the questions that that has come up in a number of the talks has been the idea of, we keep expanding what we think of as belonging in the archive. And it goes back to even with Genevieve talking about scholars at the turn of the 17th, 18th century and their ideas of what needed preservation and publication. And we watch now as other language traditions, other religious traditions, other material formats, all come into our purview, and we all wind up saying, oh, wait a second, that needs to be treated in similar way to those things over there. And I mean, it does very much link into the theme of the conference, that how much of the how much of what is there is archive, and how far out do you have to go from the clean, well-lighted place in the center to where it starts getting dark.
Yeah, if I can come back on that one quickly, you know, the one thing we see with the graffiti is all the way through historically and even into the modern world, the graffiti is a paradox when it comes to, you know, people's perceptions and people's, you know, it really is about perceptions of value. So when we're looking at a medieval church wall and we have a beautiful black letter text inscription, which is telling us about someone's, you know, life, someone's death, that clearly for most historians, most archivists, and certainly most archaeologists has value. You know, we then look at something where we see the same church wall and someone has left, you know, an account of their visit in 1987. Does that have the same value? Does it, you know, should that also be part of that same archive? And, you know, in fact, 1987, wrong choice of a term. Let's say 1927. So it sits just outside of our own personal, you know, our own personal chronology, as it were. And then you can even bring that further forward. You know, people might say, well, why would we want to record someone's graffiti from the 1920s? But do we then record graffiti left by American soldiers in Normandy in 1944? You know, I would argue that's obviously, you know, part of the historical record and therefore is, you know, worth preservation. Do we then look around and go, oh, actually, we should be recording and archiving some of the Black Lives Matters graffiti that's on the walls now, that is only 2 weeks old? You know, this is the paradox about graffiti, is when does it start to have value? And that value is entirely, you know, it's entirely placed upon it by the viewer. So it's an archive which, frankly, unlike, you know, it isn't curated by, you know, the archivist. The person who decides whether this has value is the viewer at the end of the day. And I think that makes it slightly different from, you know, many other archives. As I have, you know, as I think I said in the presentation, because we are taking a more archaeological approach to it, we record everything. So we record the medieval, we record the early modern, but also, as you saw at Norwich Cathedral, we'll record graffiti that was put there last week because it's all part of that larger corpus. And then really it's for those people, you know, in the future to decide whether it belongs to an archive or it has value to them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the interesting thing also is that you're working on sort of flipping things that have often been looked at as personal and therefore negligible cultural value in the broader sense, and saying, no, actually, these are public, these are communications.
Yeah, but also that whole perception of graffiti as being, you know, this antisocial, destructive, you know,
right,
something negative. That's a very, very modern perception. You know, it really doesn't even start to appear until the middle of the 19th century. You know, we've got a lot of documentary evidence now, which is, you know, graffiti back pre-1850 is seen as both, you know, accepted and acceptable. No one has any problem with it whatsoever. What I always love about you know, the term graffiti as well is it's entirely made up, and it was made up by archaeologists. It was made up to, you know, they needed a word to describe the informal inscriptions they were coming across at places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, and it's a made-up term that doesn't appear until the middle of the 19th century. And it's also about that time that graffiti starts to be seen as, you know, something which is, you know, antisocial. So yeah, this is all part of this bigger paradox. You know, it's, as I say, the one thing about graffiti is it crosses all these different boundaries, and that includes archives.
Right. Actually, what struck me, Anna Dorofeeva, is you're working at, in a sense, the other end of the scale, with ciphers that are intended in some ways to be readable only by certain people, rather than being public communications that can be seen by anybody who happens to walk in the church and notice. And I mean, it strikes me the whole social cultural matrix in which ciphers exist as part of what, in fact, are public documents. You know, I copy out a missal, and then on the last page, I put a cipher, and or the kind of thing of putting an acrostic in the introduction of something that if you're not paying attention to it, you don't realize that part of the decoration of the manuscript is itself intended to be read. And I was just wondering, does that strike interesting sparks for you? Unmute yourself, please.
So who are you addressing there?
Anna Dorotheva.
I would actually argue that what I'm looking at is the same as what Matthew is looking at, in the sense that it's a particular set of graphic symbols that are intended to be understood and read by a particular set of people, and who gets to read that and why depends entirely on the chosen context in which the symbols are being presented. So in the case of graffiti presented on the wall of a church, or on other monuments. In the case of medieval manuscripts, you can have the ciphers embedded within the overall presentation of a page, as I showed in my talk, and intended for as a high status manuscript to be given to someone who you know well, or it can be a particular community cipher that is just inserted in the margin. And actually that placement between center page, as it were, and margin is an interesting distinction. You know, what determines the choice of putting something more marginally rather than more centrally. So I think that there's a certain parallel there between writing that we would consider to be marginal in some way, as Matthew pointed out, with graffiti. And indeed with the Black Lives Matter material, which I believe actually is being collected as ephemera from the movement, that is being collected by libraries now as well. So I think there's a very nice wide debate to be had there about, you know, what messages we encode and embed within what media and for what purpose. And just within that context, I wanted to share this tweet that I saw on Twitter just now while we were speaking regarding the question of what we archive and why. So just an interesting little thing there.
Yeah. No, when I was listening to your talk, it was very interesting. It reminded me of a couple of books that I have run into. Early 15th century copies of medieval English works with a very ingenious alphanumeric cipher, which seems to have been invented by this particular fellow. He just made up his own way of combining the numbers to stand for the letters of the alphabet. And he did it in a couple of books. But the interesting thing is, it's an ex libris. And the point of an ex libris is to say to other people that this is my book, but other people can't read it.
But then the visual form of the cipher itself potentially might be an indication of its own, that this is a very specific book belonging to a very specific person. So there's some really fascinating things going on there, I think, with context, and it's kind of been overlooked for ciphers actually, because people have tended to look at ciphers as groups, you know, find a whole bunch of manuscripts which all contain a specific particular kind of cipher that's the same. But actually what you need to do is be looking at the time and place when that cipher was copied and what else was being copied in books at the same time. Because that's all indicative of the context as well, I think, anyway.
Right. Right.
My favorite cipher is actually a set of what is called knock runes. On the flyleaf of a manuscript. And he essentially says, you know, knock once for A, twice for B, 3 times for C. And by doing that, you can make words, and you can, as a monk, communicate with other monks in your cells during quiet hour, during quiet reading.
Like in prisons.
Quite.
Like in prison. Yeah, yeah. Well, in cells one way or another.
Indeed.
Where you're not intended to speak to each other. Yeah, one of the interesting things Nancy Turner has commented, this conversation has been circling questions about redefining canon. Digitization is helping to expand the canon for scholars, but isn't also about costs of reproduction and openness of access that will ultimately redefine the canon for medieval lit and art histories, i.e., what gets reproduced in textbooks and included in lectures and teaching. What do you think, guys? Somebody want to pick that up?
If I may, I would like to ask Anna if she finds that her particular topic is now easier to publish on, or in one way or another harder.
You mean in relation to the question that Michael's just asked?
Yes, exactly. Now that you have so much more images at the ready of your material, and it seems that your work is really at that sort of intersection of text and graphic.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely easier. There's no question that I couldn't have done this project 10 years ago. And the way that I've discovered quite a few of the ciphers that I've looked at is simply by trawling through hundreds of manuscript images, because they're just not recorded in catalogs or in any other material. And I mean, in relation to that, my work has become easier as well through the work of other people who have focused on marginalia and on comments and glosses and glossaries as being important. So there's a growing understanding in manuscript studies that actually the meta text is in some cases as important as the text, the main text itself. And so again, I can write within that kind of quite positive, receptive atmosphere, which I would have had maybe to battle to do some years ago.
That's an interesting observation to end with. We are unfortunately out of time, and we do need to stay on schedule. So yes, let's all continue to think about these things and bring the issues up in the other sessions. Folks, thank you very, very much. And thank you again to all the organizers. Not, of course, the 3 named people, Stephen and Julie and Anthony, but also to all of the other people, Llewellyn and Tom and what that, you know, whose names don't go on the programs, but who make the thing work. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Making it work, yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.